Battle of the Tagati and the Town Raffa night scene in the High Street. Oxford description of the combatants' attack of the gunsmen upon the mitre evolutions of the assailants' maneuvers of the proctors and bulldog's perilous condition of Blackmantle and his associates, Eglantine, Echo, and Transit Snug, retreat of Lionize the High Street after the battle origin of the Argoteers, an invention of cant phrases history of the intestine wars and civil broils of Oxford. From the time of Alfred origin, of the late strife ancient ballad retreat, of the Tagati reflections of a freshman black matins, or the effect of late drinking upon early riser's visit to Golgotha, or the place of Skull's lecture, from the bigwig's Tom Echo, receives sentence of rustication. The clocks of Oxford were echoing each other in proclaiming the hour of midnight, when Eglantine led the way by opening the door of his hospitium to descend into the quadrangle of Brazen Nose. "Steady, steady, old fellows," said Horace. "Remember the dawn on the first floor, hush, all be silent as the grave till you pass his oak." "Let us row him, let us fumigate the old fellow," said Echo. "This is the night of purification, lads bring some pipes and a little frankincense, Mark." And in this laudable enterprise of blowing a saffitida smoke through the dawn's keyhole, the whole party were about to be instantly engaged, when an accidental slip of Eglantine's spoiled the joke. While in the act of remonstrating with his jovial companions on the dangerous consequences attending detection, the scholar sustained a fall which left him suddenly deposited against the oak of the crabbed old master of arts, who inhabited rooms on the top of the lower staircase. Fortunately, the dignitary had on that evening carried home more liquor than learning from the common room, and was at the time of the accident almost as sound asleep as the original founder. "There lies the demene of the feast," said Echo, "knocked down in true orthodox style by the bishop. Follow your leader, boys, and take care of your craniums, or you may chance to get a few phrenological buel psi, begin to feel that hard study has somewhat impaired my articulation. But then I can always raise a perpendicular. You see always good at mathematics. D.N. Aristotle and the rest of the saints. Say I, you see what comes of being logical." All of which exultation over poor Eglantine's disaster, Echo had the caution to make while steadying himself by keeping fast hold of one of the balustrades on the landing, which that arch-wag Transit perceiving, managed to cut nearly through with a knife, and then putting his foot against it, sent Tom suddenly off in a flying leap after his companion, to the uproarious mirth of the whole party. By the time our two friends had recovered their legs, we were all in marching order for the mitre, working insinuosities along, for not one of the party could have moved at right angles to any given point, or have counted 6 street lamps without at least multiplying them to a dozen. In a word, they were ripe for any spree, full of frolic, and bent on mischief. Witness the piling a huge load of coals 248 against one man's door, screwing up the oak of another, and milling the glaze of a third before we quitted the precincts of Brazen Nose, which we did separately, to escape observation from the Cerberus who guarded the portal. It is in a college wine party that the true character of your early associates are easily discoverable. Out of the excesses of the table very often spring the truest impressions, the first, but indelible affection which links kindred spirits together in aftertime, and cements with increasing years into the most inviolable friendship. Here the sallies of youth, unchecked by care or fettered by restraint, give loose to mirth and revelry, and the brilliancy of genius and the warm-hearted gaiety of pure delight are found in the highest perfection. The blue light of heaven illumined the magnificent square of Ratcliffe, when we passed from beneath the porch of Brazen Nose, and tipping with her silvery light the surrounding architecture, lent additional beauty to the solemn splendor of the scene. Sophisticated as my faculties certainly were by the copious libations and occurrences of the day, could yet admire with reverential awe the imposing grandeur by which I was surrounded. A wayward being from my infancy, not the least mark of my eccentricity is the peculiar humor in which I find myself when I have sacrificed too freely to the jolly god. Unlike the major part of mankind, my temperament, instead of being invigorated and enlivened by the sparkling juice of the grape, loses its wonted nerve and elasticity. A somber gloominess pervades the system, the pulse becomes nervous and languid, the spirits flagging and depressed, and the mind full of chimerical apprehensions and ennui. It was in this mood that Eglantine found me ruminating on the noble works before me, while resting against a part of the pile of Radcliffe Library, contemplating the elegant crocketed pinnacles of All Souls, the delicately taper spire of St. Mary's, and the clustered enrichments and imperial canopies of masonry, and splendid traceries which everywhere strike the eye. All of which objects were rendered trebly impressive from the stillness of the night, and the flittering light by which they were illumined. I had enough of wine and frolic, and had hoped to have shirked the party and stolen quietly to my lodgings, there to indulge in my lucubrations on the scene one had witnessed, and note in my journal, according to my usual practice, the more prominent events of the day, when Horace commenced with, "Where the devil, old fellow, have you been hiding yourself? I've been hunting you some time. A little cut, I suppose. Never mind, my boy, you'll be better presently. Here's glorious sport on foot, don't you hear the war cry?" At this moment, a buzz of distant voices broke upon the ear like the mingled shouts of an election tumult. "There they are, old fellow. Come, buckle on your armor, we must try your mettle tonight. All the university are out a glorious row come along. No shirking thee to Gotti against the town raff, remember the sacred cause, my boy." And in this way, spite of all remonstrance, was I dragged through the lane and enlisted with the rest of my companions into a corps of university men who were just forming themselves in the High Street to repel the daring attack of the very scum of the city, who had ill-treated and beaten some gownsmen in the neighborhood of St. Thomas's, and had the temerity to follow and assail them in their retreat to the High Street with every description of villainous epithet, and still more offensive and destructive missiles. "Stand fast there, old fellows," said Echo, who, although devilishly cut, seemed to be the leader of the division. "Where's old Mark Supple?" "Here I am, sir, take notice," said the old scout, who appeared as active as tilde 250 tilde tilde an American rifleman. "Will Peake send us the bludgeons? He won't open his doors, sir, for anybody, take notice." Then down with the mitre, my hearties, and instantly a rope was thrown across the bishop's cap by old Mark, and the tin sign, lamp, and all came tumbling into the street, smashed into 1,000 pieces. Peake, looking out of an upper window in his nightcap. "Doey, be quiet, and go along, for God's sake, gentlemen. I shall be ruinated and discommoned if I open my door to anybody. Tom Echo, you infernal old fox hunter. If you don't doff your knowledge bag and come to the door, we'll mill all your glaze, burst open your gates, and hamstring all your horses. Mrs. Peake in her nightgown. Stand out of the way, Peake, let me speak to the gentleman. Gentlemen, Doey, gentlemen, consider my reputation and the reputation of Ray House. Oh dear, gentlemen, Doey go somewhere else, we've no sticks here, I azure ye, and we're all in bed. Doey go, gentlemen, pray do. Transit. Dame Peake, if you don't open your doors directly, we'll break them open, and unkennel that old bagged fox, your husband, and drink all the black strap in your cellar, and play the devil with the maids. Mrs. Peake. Don't he say so, mister? Transit, I know you to be a quiet, peaceable gentleman, and I am sure you will befriend me. Doey persuade him to go away, pray do. Tilde 251, tilde tilde. Mark Supple. Dame Peake. Mrs. Peake. Oh, mister. Mark Supple, are you there? I talk to the gentleman, mister. Mark, pray do. Mark Supple. It's no use, Dame Peake, they won't be gammon, take notice. If you have any old broom handles, throw 'em out directly, and if not, throw all the brooms you have in the house out of window, throw out all your sticks, throw Peake out. I'm for the gown, take notice. Down with the town. Down with the town. Bill Mags. The waiter at a lower window, hissed, mister. Echo, mister. Eglantine, hissed, master's gone to the back of the house with all the sticks he can muster. And here's an old kitchen chair you can break up and make bludgeons of, throwing the chair out of window, and here's the cook's rolling pin, and I'll go and forage for more ammunition. Horace Eglantine. You're a right good fellow, Bill, and I'll pay you before I do your master, and the brazen-nosed men shall make your fortune. Tom Echo. But where's the academicals I sent old Captain Cook, for one we shall be beating one another in the dark, without caps and gowns. Captain Cook, a scout of Christ Church, here I be, sir. That old rogue, Dick Shirley, refuses to send any gowns. He says he has nothing but noblemen's gowns and gold tufts in his house. Tilde 252, tilde. The Hun, Elilohimi and lionize. By the honor of my ancestry, that fellow shall never draw another stitch for Christ Church as long as he lives. Come along, Captain. By the honor of my ancestry, we'll uncase the old Snyder. We'll have gowns, I warrant me, noble or not noble, gold tufts or no tufts. Come along, Cook. In a few moments old Captain Cook and the exquisite returned loaded with gowns and caps, having got in at the window and completely cleared the tailor's shop of all his academicals, in spite of his threats or remonstrances. In the interim, old Mark Supple and Echo had succeeded in obtaining a supply of broom handles and other weapons of defense, when the insignia of the university, the toga and cap, were soon distributed indiscriminately. The numbers of the university men increased every moment, and the yell of the town raff seemed to gain strength with every step as they approached the scene of action. Gown, gown, town, town, were the only sounds heard in every direction, and the clamor and the tumult of voices were enough to shake the city with dismay. The authorities were by no means idle, but neither proctors or pros, or marshal, or bulldogs, or even deans, dons, and dignitaries, for such there were, who strained their every effort to quell the disturbance, were at all attended to, and many who came as peacemakers were compelled in their own defense to take an active part in the fray. From the bottom of the High Street to the end of the Corn Market, and across again through St. Aldate's to the Old Bridge, everywhere the more peaceable and respectable citizens might be seen popping their noddles out of window and rubbing their half-closed eyes with affright to learn the cause of the alarming strife. Tilde 253 tilde of the strong band of university men who rushed on eager for the coming fray, a number of them were fresh, light-hearted Etonians and old Westminsters, who having just arrived to place themselves under the sacred banners of Academus, thought their honor and their courage both concerned in defending the Togati. Most of these youthful zealots had, as usual, at the beginning of a term, been lodged in the different inns and houses of the city, and from having drank somewhat freely of the welcome cup with old schoolfellows and new friends, were just ripe for mischief, unheedful of the consequences or the cause. On the other hand, the original fomenters of the strife had recruited their forces with herds of the lowest rabble gathered from the purlieus of their patron saints, St. Clement and St. Thomas, and the shores of the Charwell, the bargees and butchers and laborers and scum of the suburbians, a huge conglomerated mass of thick skulls and broad backs and strengthy arms and sturdy legs and throats bawling for revenge and hearts bursting with wrathful ire, rendered still more frantic and desperate by the magic influence of their accustomed war-whoop. These formed the base barbarian race of Oxford truants, one, including every vile thing that passes under the generic name of raff. From college to college, the mania spread with the rapidity of an epidemic wind, and scholars, students, and fellows were everywhere in motion. Here a stout bachelor of arts might be seen knocking down the ancient Cerberus who opposed his passage. There, the iron-bound college gates were forced open by the united power of the youthful inmates. In another quarter might be seen the heir of some noble family risking his neck in the headlong leap, too. And near him, a party of the Togati scaling the sacred battlements with as much energetic zeal as the ancient crusaders would have displayed against the ferocious Saracens. One, the French truans were beggars, who, under the pretense of asking alms, committed the most atrocious crimes and excesses. Two, it was on one of these occasions that the celebrated Charles James Fox made that illustrious leap from the window of Hertford College. Tilde 254 tilde scouts flying in every direction to procure caps and gowns, and scholars dropping from towers and windows by bell ropes and sheet ladders. Every countenance exhibiting as much ardor and frenzied zeal, as if the consuming elements of earth and fire threatened the demolition of the sacred city of Reticina. It was on the spot where once stood the ancient conduit of Carfax, flanked on the one side by the venerable church of St. Martin and the colonnade of the old butter market, and on the other by the town hall, from the central point of which terminate, south, west, and north, St. Aldate's, the butcher row, and the corn market, that the scene exhibited its more substantial character. It was here the assailants first caught sight of each other, and the yell and noise and deafening shouts became terrific. In a moment all was fury and confusion. In the onset the gown, confident and daring, had evidently the advantage, and the retiring RAF fell back in dismay, while the advancing and victorious party laid about them with their quarterstaves, and knuckles drawing blood or teeth or cracking crowns at every blow, until they had driven them back to the end of the corn market. It was now that the strong arm and still stronger science of the sturdy bachelors of Brazennose, and the square-built, athletic sons of Cambria, the Joneses of Jesus, proved themselves of sterling metal, and bore the brunt of the battle with unexampled courage. At this instant, a second reinforcement arriving from the canals and wharfs on the banks of the Isis, having forced their way by George Lane, brought timely assistance to the town RAF, and enabled them again to rally and present so formidable an appearance, 255 that the Tagati deemed it prudent to retreat upon their reserve, who were every moment accumulating in immense numbers in the High Street. To this spot the townsmen, exulting in their trifling advantage, had the temerity to follow and renew the conflict, and here they sustained the most signal defeat. For the men of Christ Church and Pembroke and St. Mary's Hall and Oriel and Corpus Christi had united their forces in the rear, while the front of the gown had fallen back upon the effective Trinitarians, and Albanians and Wathamites and men of Magdalen, who had by this time roused them from their monastic towers and cells to fight the holy war and defend their classic brotherhood. Nor was this all the advantages the gown had to boast of, for the scouts, ever true to their masters, had summoned the lads of the fancy, and Marston Will and Harry Bell and a host of out-and-outers came up to the scratch, and floored many a yokel with their bunch of fives. It was at this period that the conflict assumed its most appalling feature, for the townsmen were completely hemmed into the center, and fought with determined courage, presenting a hollow square, two fronts of which were fully engaged with the infuriated gown. Long and fearful was the struggle for mastery, and many and vain the attempts of the townsmen to retreat, until the old Oxford night coach, in its way up the High Street to the Star Inn in the Corn Market, was compelled to force its passage through the conflicting parties. When the bulldogs and the constables, headed by Marshal Holliday and old Jack Smith, united their forces, and following the vehicle, opened a passage into the very center of the battle, where they had for some time to sustain the perilous attacks of oaths and blows and kicks from both parties, until having fairly wedged themselves between the combatants, they succeeded by threats and entreaties, and seizing a few of the ringleaders on 256 both sides, to cause a dispersion, and restore by degrees the peace of the city. It was, however, some hours before the struggle had completely subsided, a running fight being kept up by the various straggling parties in their retreat, and at intervals the fearful cry of town and gown would resound from some plebeian alley or murky lane, as an unfortunate wight of the adverse faction was discovered stealing homewards, covered with mud and scars. Of my college friends and merry companions in the fray, Tom Echo alone remained visible, and he had, in his own phraseology, dropped his sash. According to Hudibras, he looked as men of inward light are wont to turn their optics in upont, or in plain English, had an invisible eye. The disjecta fragmenta of his academical robe presented a most pitiful appearance. It was of the ragged sort, like the mendicula impluviata of Plautus, and his under habiliments bore evident marks of his having bitten the dust, i.e., mud beneath the ponderous arm of some heroic blacksmith or bargee, but yet he was lively, and what with blows and exertion, perfectly sobered. What Blackmantle! And alive, old fellow! Well clone, my hearty. I saw you set to with that fresh-water devil from Charwell, the old bargee, and a pretty milling you gave him. I had intended to have seconded you, but just as I was making up, a son of Vulcan let fly his sledge-hammer slap at my smeller and stopped up one of my oculars, so I was obliged to turn to and finish him off. And when I had completed the job, you had bolted. Not, however, without leaving your marks behind you. But where's Eglantine? Where's Transit? Where's the Honorable? By my soul, the roué can handle his mollies well. I saw him floor one of the RAF in very prime style. But come along, my hearty. We must walk over the ~257 field of battle and look after the wounded. I am desperately afraid that Eglantine is booked inside. Saw him, surrounded by the bulldog's maid, a desperate effort to rescue him and had some difficulty to clear myself. But never mind, 'tis the fortune of war, and there's very good lodging in the castle. Surely there's Mark Supple with someone on his back. What Mark is that you? No, sir, yes, sir, I mean, sir, it's a gentleman of our college, oh dearie me. I thought it had been a proctor or a bulldog, for heaven's sake, help, sir. Here's Mr. Transit quite senseless. Take notice, picked him up in a doorway in Lincoln Lane, bleeding like a pig, take notice. Oh dear, what a night this has been. We shall all be sent to the castle, and perhaps transported for manslaughter. For heaven's sake, Mr. Echo, help. Bear his head up, take hold of his feet, Mr. Blackmantle, and I'll go before and ring it, Doctor. Tuckwell's bell, take notice. In this way poor Transit was conveyed to the surgery, where, after cleansing him from the blood and dirt and the application of some aromatics, he soon recovered, and happily had not sustained any very serious injury. From old Mark, we learned that Eglantine was a captive to the bulldogs, and safely deposited in the castle along with Marston Will, who had fought nobly in his defense. Of Lion Eyes we could gain no other tidings than that Mark had seen him at the end of the fray climbing up to the first-floor window of a tradesman's house in the High Street, whose daughter it was well known he had a little intrigue with, and where, as we concluded, he had found a balsam for his wounds and shelter for the night. It was nearly 3 o'clock when I regained my lodging and found Maggs, the waiter of the Mitre, on the lookout for me. Echo had accompanied me home, and in our way we had picked up a wounded man of University College, who had suffered severely in the contest. It was worthy the pencil of a Hogarth to have depicted the appearance of the High Street after the contest, when we were cautiously perambulating from end to end in search of absent friends, and fearing at every step the approach of the proctors or their bulldogs. The lamps were almost all smashed, and the burners dangling to and fro with the wind, the greater part extinguished, or just emitting sufficient light to make night horrible. On the lamp irons might be seen what at first sight was most appalling, the figure of some hero of the Tagati dangling by the neck, but which, on nearer approach, proved to be only the dismembered academical of some gentleman commoner hung up as a trophy by the town RAF. Broken windows and shutters torn from their hinges, and missiles of every description covering the ground, from the terrific Scotch paving pebble torn up from the roads, to the spokes of coach wheels, and the oaken batons, and fragments of lanterns belonging to the town watch, skirts of coats, and caps, and remnants of togas both silken and worsted, bespoke the quality of the heroes of the fray. While here and there a poor terrified wretch was exposing his addle head to the mildews of the night damp, fearing a revival of the contest, or anxiously watching the return of husband, brother, father, or son. 3. This picture of an Oxford row is not, as the general reader might imagine, the mere fiction of the novelist, but the true description of a contest which occurred some few years since, the leading features of which will be, although the names have been, except in 1 or 2 instances, studiously suppressed, easily recognized by many of the present sons of Alma Mater who shared in the perils and glory of the battle. To those who are strangers to the sacred city, and these casual effervescences of juvenile spirit, the admirable graphic view of the scene by my friend Bob Transit, see plate, will convey a very correct idea. To the credit of the more respectable and wealthy class of Oxford citizens it should be told, they are now too sensible of their own interest, and, besides, too well informed to mix with these civil disturbances. The lower orders, therefore, finding themselves unequal to the contest without their support, submit to the Tagati. And thus the civil wars that have raged in Oxford with very little interruption from the days of Alfred seem for the present extinguished. 259. On our arrival at the Mitre, poor Mrs. Peake, half frightened to death, was up and busy in administering to the sufferers various consolatory draughts composed of bishop, and flesh and blood for, and rumbooze, while the chambermaids, and Peake, and the waiters were flying about the house with warm water and basins and towels, to the relief of the numerous applicants, who all seemed anxious to wash away the dirty remembrances of the disgusting scene. Hitherto, I had been so busily engaged in defending myself and preserving my friends that I had not a moment for reflection. It has been well observed that place an Englishman in the field of battle, no matter what his political feelings, he will fight like a lion by instinct or the mere force of example. So with the narrator of this contest. I had not, up to this time, the least knowledge of the original cause of the row. I have naturally an aversion to pugilistic contests and tumultuous sports, and yet I found by certain bruises and bumps and stains of blood and stiffness of joints and exhaustion, and the loss of my upper garment, which I had then only just discovered, that I must have borne a pretty considerable part in the contest, and carried away no small share of victorious laurels, since I had escaped without any very visible demonstration of my adversary's prowess. But for this I must acknowledge myself indebted to my late private tutor, the Eton cad, Joe Cannon, whose fancy lectures on nosology and the science of the milling system had enabled me to 4 brandy and port wine, half and half. 5 an Oxford phrase. Defend my bread basket, cover up my peepers, and keep my knob out of chancery. 6. A merit that all. 6. The use of a peculiar cant phraseology for different classes, it would appear, originated with the Argoliers, a species of French beggars or monkish impostors, who were notorious for everything that was bad and infamous. These people assumed the form of a regular government, elected a king, established a fixed code of laws, and invented a language peculiar to themselves, constructed probably by some of the debauched and licentious youths, who, abandoning their scholastic studies, associated with these vagabonds. In the poetical life of the French robber Cartouche, a humorous account is given of the origin of the word argot, and the same author has also compiled a dictionary of the language then in use by these people, which is annexed to the work. Hannon, in his very singular work, published in 1566, entitled A Caveat, or Warning for Common Cursetors, runners, vulgarly called vagabonds, has described a number of the words then in use, among what he humorously calls the lewd lousy language of these loitering bisquets and lacy loverels. And it will be remembered that at that time, many of the students of our universities were among these cursetors, as we find by an old statute of the Roman 22 of Hen. VIII, that scholars at the universities begging without license were to be punished like common cursitors. The vagabonds of Spain are equally celebrated for their use of a peculiar slang or cant, as will be seen on reference to a very curious work of Raphael Fraianaro entitled Il Vagabondo, overo sferzo debianti e vagabondi. Viterbo, 1620, 12 mo. As also in those excellent novels, Lazarillo du Tormes and Guzman de Alfaraque. The Romany or Gypsies dialect is given with the history of that singular people by Mr. Grellman, an English translation of which was published in 1787 by Roper in quarto. From those works, Groves principally compiled his Lexicon Ballatronicum. In the present day, we have many professors of slang, and in more ways than one, too many of cant, the greater part of whom are dull impostors, who rather invent strange terms to astonish the vulgar than adhere to the peculiar phrases of the persons they attempt to describe. It has long been matter of regret with the better order of English sporting men that the pugilistic contests and turf events of the day are not written in plain English, which all those who run might read, instead of being rendered almost unintelligible by being narrated in the language of beggars, thieves, and pickpockets, a jargon as free from true wit as it is full of obscenity. Learning would not have compensated for under the peculiar circumstances in which I was placed. It was now that the mischief was done, and many a sound head was cracked, and many a courageous heart was smarting, 'neath their wounds in the gloomy dungeons of the castle, or waiting in their rooms the probing instrument and plasters of Messrs. Wall, or Kidd, or Bourne, that a few of us, who had escaped tolerably well, and were seated round a bowl of bishop in the snug sanctum sanctorum of the mitre, began to inquire of each other the origin of the fray. After a variety of conjectures and vague reports, each at variance with the other, and evidently deficient in the most remote connection with the true cause of the strife, it was agreed to submit the question to the waiter, as a neutral observer, who assured us that the whole affair arose out of a trifling circumstance, originating with some mischievous boys, who, having watched two gownsmen into a Cyprian temple in the neighborhood of St. Thomas, circulated a false report that they had carried thither the wives of two respectable mechanics. Without taking the trouble to inquire into the truth or falsehood of the accusation, the door was immediately beset. The old cry of town and gown vociferated in every direction, and the unfortunate whites compelled to seek their safety by an ignominious flight through a back door and over the meadows. The tumult once raised, it was not to be appeased without some victim, and for this purpose they thought proper to attack a party of the Tagati, who were returning home from a little private sport with a well-known fancy lecturer. The opportunity was a good one to show off. A regular fight commenced, and the RAF were floored in every direction, until their numbers increasing beyond all. 7. The highly respected and learned headmaster of Eton College. 262 comparison, the university men were compelled to raise the cry of gown, and fly for succor and defense to the High Street. In this way had a few mischievous boys contrived to embroil the town and university in one of the most severe intestine struggles ever remembered. A true chronicle of ye bloody fight between the clerks of and scholars of Oxenford and the townsmen of the city, who were crowding round the eastern gate to see the king enter in his progress westward. 263, Sir Geark of Oxenford, prepare your robus rich and noble cheer. Ye king with a le, his courtly train is spurring on your place to gain. And hear ye trumpets' merry note, his near approach proclaims, I wot. Ye doctors, proctors, scholars, go, and for your sovereign bend ye low. Now comes the king in grand array, and the scholars press along the way, till ye eastern gate was thronged so round, that passage coulda no where be found. Then the sheriff's men, their upraised spears, did ply about the people's ears. And woe the day, the rabble root their spears did break like glass about. Then the doctors, proctors, for the king, most lustily for room did singe. But though they bawled out amen, no passage through the crowd coulda gain. Ye northern gownsmen, a bold race, now swore they'd quickly free the place. With stalwart gripe and beetle's staff they cleft the townsmen's skulls in half. 264, And now the wrathful rabble rave, and quick return with club and stave, and heads right learned in classic lore felt as they'd never felt before. Now fierce and bloody grows the fray. In vain the mayor and sheriff pray for peace to cool the townsmen's ire, entreaty but impels the fire. Down with the town. The scholars cry, down with the gown. The town reply. Loud rattle the caps of the clerks in air, and the citizens many a sortie bear, and many a churchman fought his way, like a hero in the bloody fray. And one right portly father slew of rabble townsmen not a few. And now mid the battle's strife and din there came to the eastern gate the heralda of our lord the king, with his merry men all in state. God help us, quoth the courtly child, what means this noise within? With joy the people have run wilda. And so he peeped him in, and through the wicker gate he spied, and marveled much thereat, the streets with crimson current dyed, and town and gown laid flat. Then he called his merry men aloud, to bring him a ladder straight. The trumpet sounds the warlike crowd in a moment forget their hate. Uprise the wounded, down their arms both town and gown do lie. The kinges approachy people charms, and alle look merrily. For howe'er town and gown may fight, yet both are true to ye kinge. So on both may learning and honor light, let all men gaily singe 1. 265, 1. The above imitation of the style of the ancient ballad is founded on traditional circumstances said to have occurred when the pacific King James visited Oxford. Bernard Blackmantle. Intestine broils and civil wars of Oxford. Anthony Wood, the faithful historian of Oxford, gives an account of a quarrel between the partisans of St. Ginbald and the residents of Oxford in the days of Alfred, on his refounding the university, A.D. 886. After his death, the continual inroads of the Danes kept the Oxonians in perpetual alarm, and in the year 979 they destroyed the town by fire, and repeated their outrage upon the new-built town in 1002. 7 years after, Sweyn, the Danish leader, was repulsed by the inhabitants in a similar attempt, who took vengeance on their implacable enemy by a general massacre on the Feast of St. Brice. In the civil commotions under the Saxon prince, Oxford had again its full share of the evils of war. After the death of Harold, William the Conqueror was bravely opposed by the citizens in his attempt to enter Oxford, which, effecting by force, he was so much exasperated at their attachment to Harold that he bestowed the government of the town on Robert de Oilgo, a Norman, with permission to build a castle to keep his Oxford subjects in awe. The disturbances during the reign of Stephen and his successor were frequent, and in the reign of John d. 1209, an unfortunate occurrence threatened the entire destruction of Oxford as a seat of learning. A student engaged in thoughtless diversion killed a woman and fled from justice. A band of citizens, with the mayor at their head, surrounded the hall to which he belonged and demanded the offender. On being informed of his absence, the lawless multitude seized 3 of the students, who were entirely unconnected with the transaction, and obtained an order from the weak king, whose dislike to the clergy is known, to put the innocent persons to death, an order which was but too promptly obeyed. The scholars, justly enraged by this treatment, quitted Oxford, some to Cambridge and Reading, and others to Maidstone in Kent. The offended students also applied to the Pope, who laid the city under an interdict and discharged all professors from teaching in it. This step completely humbled the citizens, who sent a deputation of the most respectable to wait on the Pope's legate, then at Westminster, to acknowledge their rashness and request mercy. The legate, Nicholas, Bishop of Tusculum, granted their petition only on the most humiliating terms. The mayor and corporation were enjoined, by way of penance, to proceed annually, on the day dedicated to St. Nicholas, to all the parish churches bareheaded, with hempen halters round their necks and whips in their hands, on their bare feet, and in their shirts, and there pray the benefit of absolution from the priests, repeating the penitential psalms, and to pay a mark of silver per annum to the students of the hall peculiarly injured. In addition to which they were, on the recurrence of the same day, to entertain 100 poor scholars, honesty's refectionibus. The abbot of Evesham yearly paying 16 shillings towards the festival expense a part of this ceremony, but without the degrading marks of it, is continued to this day. Henry III occasionally resided at Oxford and held there many parliaments and councils. In the reign of this king, the university flourished to an unexampled degree, the number of students being estimated at 15,000. Its popularity was about this time also greatly increased from the circumstance of not less than 1,000 students quitting the learned institutions of Paris and repairing to Oxford for instruction. But these foreigners introduced so dangerous a levity of manners that the Pope deemed it necessary to send his legate for the purpose of reforming certain flagrant corruptions of the place. The legate was at first treated with much affected civility, but an occasion for quarrel being soon found, he would, in all probability, have been sacrificed upon the spot, had he not hidden himself in a belfry from the fury of the assailants. This tumult was, by the exercise of some strong measures, speedily appeased, but the number of students was at this period infinitely too great to preserve due subordination. They divided themselves into parties, among which the north and south countrymen were the most violent, and their quarrels harassing and perpetual. According to the rude temper of the age, these disputes were not settled by argument, but by dint of blows, and the peace of the city was in this way so often endangered that the king thought it expedient to add to the civil power 2 aldermen and 8 burgesses assistant, together with 2 bailiffs. From petty and intestine broils, the students appear to have acquired a disposition for political interference. When Prince Edward, returning from Paris, marched with an army towards Wales, coming to Oxford he was by the burghers refused admittance, on occasion of the tumults now prevailing among the barons. He quartered his soldiers in the adjacent villages, and lodged himself that night in the royal palace of Magdalen, the next morning proceeding on his intended journey. But the scholars, who were shut in the town, being desirous to salute a prince whom they loved so much, first assembled round Smithgate and demanded to be let into the fields, which being refused by one of the bailiffs, they returned to their hostels for arms and broke open the gate, whereupon the mayor arrested many of them, and, on the chancellor's request, was so far from releasing them that he ordered the citizens to bring out their banners and display them in the midst of the street. And then, embattling them, commanded a sudden onset on the rest of the scholars remaining in the town. And much bloodshed had been committed had not a scholar, by the sound of the school bell in St. Mary's Church, given notice of the danger that threatened the students, then at dinner. On this alarm they straightways armed and went out, and in a tremendous conflict, subdued and put the townsmen to flight. In consequence of this tumult, the king required the scholars to retire from the city during the time of holding his parliament. The chief part of the students accordingly repaired to Northampton, where, shortly after the insurgent barons had fortified themselves, on the king's laying siege to the place, the scholars, offended by their late removal, joined with the nobility, and repaired to arms under their own standard, behaving in the fight with conspicuous gallantry, and greatly increasing the wrath of the king, who, however, on the place being subdued, was restrained from pursuing them to extremities, from prudential motives. As the kingdom became more settled, the disturbances were less frequent, and within the last century assumed the character of sportive rows rather than malicious feuds. On a recent lamentable occasion, now happily forgotten, the political feelings of the gown and town in some measure revived the spirit of the olden time. But since then, peace has waved her olive branch over the city of Oxford, and perfect harmony, let us hope, will exist between town and gown forevermore. 266. The veil of night was more than half drawn, ere the youthful inmates of the Mitre retired to rest, and many of the party were compelled to put up with sorry accommodation. Such was the influx of 267 gownsmen, who, shut out of lodging and college, had sought this refuge to wait the approaching morn. A morn big, with the fate of many a scholastic woe of lectures and reprovals from tutors, and fines and impositions and denunciations from principals, of proctorial reports to the vice-chancellor, and examinations before the big wigs, and sentences of expulsion 268 and rustication, coming evils which, by anticipation, kept many a man awake upon his pillow, spite of the perilous fatigue which weighed so heavy upon the exhausted frame. The freshman had little to fear. He could plead his ignorance of college rules or escape notice altogether, from not having yet domiciled within the walls of a college. Although I had little to expect from the apprehension of any of these troubles, as my person was, from my short residence, most likely unknown to any of the authorities yet, did Morpheus refuse his soporific balsam to the mind, I could not help thinking of my young and giddy companions, of the kind-hearted Eglantine, immured within the walls of a dungeon, of the noble-spirited Echo, maltreated and disfigured by the temporary loss of an eye, of the facetious Bob Transit, so bruised and exhausted that a long illness might be expected, and lastly of our Eton sextile, the incomparable exquisite Lionize, who, if discovered in his dangerous frolic, would, perhaps, have to leap out of a first-floor window at the risk of his neck, sustain an action for damages, and his expulsion from college at the same time. Little Dick Gratus, with his usual cunning, had shirked us at the commencement of hostilities, and the Honorable Mr. Sparkle had been carried home to his lodging, early in the fray, more overcome by hard drinking than hard fighting, and there safely put to bed by the indefatigable Mark Supple, to whose friendly zeal and more effective arm we were all much indebted. In this reflective mood, I had watched the retiring shadows of the night gradually disperse before the gray-eyed morn, and had just caught a glimpse of the golden streaks which illumine the face of day, when my o'er-wearied spirit sank to rest. A little before 7 o'clock I was awoke by Echo, who came into my room to borrow some clean linen, to enable him to attend chapel prayers at Christ Church. Judge my surprise when I perceived my one-eyed 269 warrior completely restored to his full sight, and not the least appearance of any participation in the affair of the previous night. What? You can't comprehend how I managed my black optic. Hey, old fellow, said Echo. You shall hear. knocked up transit, and made him send for his colors, and paint it over looks quite natural, don't it? Defy the big wigs to find it outand if I can but make all right by a sop to the old Cerberus at the gate, and queer the prick bills at chapel prayers, I hope to escape the quicksands of rustication, and pass safely through the creek of proctorial jeopardy. If you're fond of fun, old fellow, jump up and view the Christ Church men proceeding to Black Matins this morning. After the Royston hunt yesterday, the dinner at the Black Bear at Woodstock and the Town and Gown Row of last night, there will be a motley procession this morning, I'll bet 100. The opportunity was a rare one to view the effect of late drinking upon early risers, see plate. Slipping on my academicals, therefore, I accompanied my friend Tom to morning prayers, a circumstance, as I have since been informed, which would have involved me in very serious disgrace, had the appearance of an ex-college man at vespers attracted the notice of any of the big wigs. Fortunately, however, I escaped the prying eyes of authority, which on these occasions are sometimes as much under the dominion of Morpheus and literally walk in their sleep from custom as the young and inexperienced betray the influence of some more seductive charm. The very bell that called the drowsy student from his bed seemed to rise and fall in accordant sympathy with the lethargic humor that prevailed, tolling in slow and half-sounding notes scarcely audible beyond the college gates. The broken light that shed its misty hue through the monastic aisle of painted windows and clustered columns gave an increased appearance of drowsiness to the scene, while the chilling air of the 270 morning nipped the young and dissolute, as it fell in hazy dews upon the bareheaded sons of Alma Mater, within many of whose bosoms the fires of the previous night's debauch were but scarce extinguished. Then came the lazy, unwashed scout, crawling along the quadrangle, rubbing his heavy eyes, and cursing his hard fate to be thus compelled to give early notice to some slumbering student of the hour of 7, waking him from dreams of bliss by thundering at his oak the summons to Black Matins. Now crept the youthful band along the avenue, and one by one the drowsy congregation stole through the Gothic antechamber that leads to Christ Church Chapel, like unwilling victims to some pious sacrifice. Here a lengthened yawn proclaimed the want of rest, and near a tremulous step and heavy half-closed eye was observed, pacing across the marble floor, with hand pressed to his os frontis, as if 1,000 odd and sickly fantasies inhabited that chamber of the muses. Now 2 friends might be seen, supporting a third, whose ghastly aspect bespoke him fresh in the sacred mysteries of college parties and of Bacchus, but who had, nevertheless, undergone a tolerable seasoning on the previous night. There a jolly Nimrod, who had just cleared the college walls, and reached his rooms time enough to cover his hunting frock and boots with his academicals, was seen racing along to scape the prick-bill's report, with his round hunting cap in his hand, in lieu of the square tufted trencher of the schools. Nightcaps thrown off in the entry shoes and stockings tied in the Isla red slipper, and the black jockey boot decorating one pair of legs was no uncommon sight, while on every side rushed forward the anxious group with gowns on one arm, or trailing after them, or loosely thrown around the shoulders to escape tribulation, with here and there a sentimental-looking personage of portly habit and solemn gait moving slowly on, filled up the motley picture. The prayers were, indeed, brief, and 271 hurried through with a rapidity that, I dare say, is never complained of by the Tagati, but is certainly little calculated to impress the youthful mind with any serious respect for these relics of monkish custom, which, after all, must be considered more in the light of a punishment for those who are compelled to attend than any necessary or instructive service connected with the true interests of orthodoxy. In a quarter of an hour, the whole group had dispersed to their respective rooms, and within the 5 minutes next ensuing, I should suppose, the greater part were again comfortably deposited beneath their bedclothes, snoozing away the time till 10 or 12 to make up for these inroads on the slumbers of the previous night. A few hours spent in my friend's rooms, lolling on the sofa, while the scout prepared breakfast, and Tom decorated his person, brought the awful hour of the morning, when all who had taken any very conspicuous share in the events of the previous night were likely to hear of their misdoings, and receive a summons to appear before the vice-chancellor in the divinity school, better known by the name of Golgotha or the place of skulls. See plate. Where, on this occasion, He was expected to meet the big wigs, to confer on some important measures necessary for the future peace and welfare of the university. The usual time had elapsed for these unpleasant visitations, and Echo was chuckling finely at his dexterity in evading the eye of authority. Nor was I a little pleased to have escaped myself, when a single rap at the oak, not unlike the hard, determined thump of an inflexible dun, in one moment revived all our worst apprehensions, and, unfortunately, with too much reason for the alarm. The proctors had marked poor Tom and traced him out, and this visit was from one of their bulldogs, bringing a summons for Echo to attend before the vice-chancellor and dignitaries. "What's to be done, old fellow?" said Echo. "I shall be ~272 expelled to a certainty and, if I don't strike my own name off the books at the buttery hatch, shall be prevented making a retreat to Cam Rhodesier out of the scrape, that's clear. And that affords me some hope, for as you are fresh, your word will pass for something in extenuation or arrest of judgment." After some little time spent in anticipating the charges likely to be brought against him, and arranging the best mode of defense, it was agreed that Echo should proceed forthwith to Golgotha, and there, with undaunted front, meet his accusers, while I was to proceed to Transit and Lionize, and having instructed them in the story we had planned, meet him at the place of skulls, fully prepared to establish, by the most incontrovertible and consistent evidence, that we were not the aggressors in the row. A little persuasion was necessary to convince both our friends that their presence would be essential to Echo's acquittal. They had too many just qualms, and fears, and prejudices of this inquisitorial court not to dread perhaps detection, and a severe reprimand themselves. Having, however, succeeded in this point, we all three compared notes, and proceeded to where the vice-chancellor and certain heads of houses sat in solemn judgment on the trembling Tagati. Echo was already under examination. One of the bulldogs had sworn particularly to Tom's being a most active leader in the fray of the previous night, and having, in the contest, suffered a complete disorganization of his lower jaw, with the total loss of sundry of his front rails, he took this opportunity of affixing the honor of the deed to my unlucky friend, expecting, no doubt, a very handsome recompense would be awarded him by the court. Expostulation was in vain. Transit, Lionize, and myself were successively called in and examined very minutely, and although we all agreed to a letter in our story and made a very clever ~273 defense of the culprit, we yet had the mortification to hear from little Dodd, who kept the door, and who is always best pleased when he can convey unpleasant tidings to the gown, that Echo had received sentence of rustication for the remainder of the term. And that Eglantine, in consideration of the imprisonment he had already undergone, and some favorable circumstances in his case, was let off with a fine and imposition. Thus ended the row of the town and gown, as far as our party was personally concerned. But many of the members of the different colleges were equally unfortunate in meeting the heavy censures and judgments of authority. I have just taken possession of my hospitium, and set down with a determination to fag. Do, therefore, keep your promise, and enliven the dull routine of college studies with some account of the world at Brighton. Bernard Blackmantle. On what dread perils doth the youth adventure, who dares within the fellow's bog to enter? The stagecoach, or the trip to Brighton.